Our first research talk is going to be Dr. Melissa Whitman. Dr. Whitman attained her Ph.D. from University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And today it's about 4 o'clock in the morning. And so we want to thank you for your arrival at this weird time. And Dr. Whitman's going to be telling us about rhododendron, the genus that plays by a different set of rules, maintaining a stress-tolerant ecological strategy along tropical elevation gradients. So if you would like to share your screen, Dr. Whitman, and take it away.
Okay, let's see, slideshow. From the beginning. Okay, so can you see that okay? Let's see. Well, hopefully you can see this. Okay, sorry, I can't tell if you can see that.
It looks great.
Oh, you can,
yeah,
okay.
Yep. Sorry, I had my mute on.
Oh.
It's not the presentation mode, but it's your normal working mode.
Okay, so now it should be okay.
Now it's presentation. Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, I am very excited to present my research, and thank you for the invitation again to do so. So I'm going to be talking more about the tropical rhododendrons. And yesterday we had some really interesting talks that addressed plant functional traits. And my talk is going to focus on that also. Functional traits, one of the main reasons to really look into them is they can give an idea of how resources are allocated, as well as kind of the life history strategy of a particular organism. So you can think of this in the simplest way, in that some have the live fast, die young approach. Others have a much more slow and steady kind of wins the race approach. Rhododendrons are on the slow and steady side of things. They tend to have leaf traits where they put a lot into each leaf. Each one is generally going to be thicker, more defended against herbivory. And also, as a consequence, though, plants tend to be much more slow growing and more short in stature relative to other woody plants. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how do these traits change usually along an elevational gradient. So these are generalizations about tropical mountains especially, and some of the plants observed there. In general, at higher elevations, you'll have more abiotic stressors, combinations of extremes of kind of temperature variation, exposure to sun, wind, things like that. And from this, you have an effect called ecological filtering, where essentially only some species can exist under those stressful conditions. And within that, when looking at the plant functional traits, you have more of a convergence of traits. One's more towards, again, traits that can withstand these type of stressors. Whereas at lower elevations, there's, in general, higher species richness, greater abundance of resources. However, as a trade-off, there tends to be more complex biotic interactions, including competition between species. That results then in a much wider range of possible functional traits based off of all these different kinds of interactions and complexities. So now I'm going to focus on rhododendron. This is kind of the ideal model taxonomic group, in my opinion. They're very interesting, both from their diversity perspective. Within the tropics, for instance, there's more than 300 species. From a biogeography perspective, they're also very unique in that they came from more temperate locations into the tropics, whereas most other angiosperms went from the tropics northwards, or southwards rather. And within this particular group also, they have species occurrence all the way from sea level to mountain summits. That is also very unusual. Usually taxonomic groups tend to be more clustered within a particular elevation range or habitat types, whereas again, rhododendron is incredibly broad. In the habitats that they occur in, you can think of it as there's quite a few within more subalpine zones, the montane forests, for instance, and most likely that's a reflection of their more temperate origins. With expansion to other habitat types, such as forest edges, disturbed areas, riparian zones, for instance, also, and low nutrient soils. One of the very unique characteristics about the tropical rhododendron also is that they are not only terrestrial, but also epiphytic in their growth forms. And that's something that is, I think, pretty interesting. I'll talk a bit more about later. There are also some species that specialize in extreme soil types, such as ultramafic or serpentine soil. Those are soil types that are extremely low in nutrients combined with heavy metals presence. So I decided to address kind of these broader research questions. One is, can an ecological strategy for a broad taxonomic group, such as rhododendron, remain constant across a broad elevation gradient? A subset of that is, how might stress-tolerant flora avoid biotic competition at lower elevations? Essentially thinking of how is it that this particular genus does have such a broad distribution, both in the latitudinal sense as well as elevation sense. So I put together this prediction. You can think of general observations observed across most plants tend to follow more the blue on this diagram. Whereas at lower elevations, you have a very wide range of functional traits, so high functional trait diversity. As you go up in elevation, there's a tapering, and more as again, species begin converging towards this kind of more stress tolerant strategies. However, for groups like rhododendron that are kind of renowned as being more stress tolerant, the prediction would then be, instead of this broad array of suites, that they would actually be fairly narrow and fairly constant across the gradient as a whole. So I want to see, does this actually apply? To do this, I collected leaf trait data from botanical gardens, primarily from combination of Rhododendron Species Foundation, Bovey's Rare Plant Nursery, and the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh for 169 species, multiple individuals per species whenever possible. Most of the plants were grown via wild collected cuttings or seeds within greenhouses. And one thing to note is that the potting medium generally consisted of more like bark or clay pellets, not necessarily soil. And then additional use of information via herbarium records or botanical monographs for information on elevation and habitat associations. So functional traits that I measured included a variety of ones related to leaf thickness, area weights, kind of what do the leaves look like, as well as more standardized metrics that give an idea, again, of more what is the life history strategy. And that includes things like specific leaf area, toughness as a metric of, for instance, resistance to herbivory, water content, as well as taking leaves and grinding them up and looking at the nutrient content of things like nitrogen and phosphorus. The statistical analyses that I looked at had a number of different steps involved. First was taking a look at trait correlations, getting an idea of general life history trade-offs. How does that compare with what is known and expected? And then additional comparisons by habitat type, as well as position along an elevation gradient. Lastly, additional comparisons to how do rhododendrons compare with other taxa, and how are they different? So results, the first part here. So this was taking a look at rhododendron traits that I collected as compared to kind of public data sets through the Global Plant Trait Network. So this was about 2,000 different plant species from around the globe. One of the things you can immediately notice is rhododendrons tend to be more clustered at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of relationship with nitrogen and SLA. Basically, that reaffirms, yes, they're on the slow end of things. What I found especially interesting, however, is that the intercept was much higher. And what that indicates is essentially rhododendrons have better resource use efficiency. They can do more with less, essentially. Next, I took a look at how do rhododendrons compare to other plants? Where do they occur within the overall trait space? And so these are some different examples here, and pretty much rhododendrons overlap mostly with kind of a trait space perspective, again, using metrics of especially SLA, with more like needle leaf type of species. So conifers, as well as some of the species from South Africa and Australia that are very tough, very highly defended leaf types. Next, I took a look at, okay, how do these traits, how does the average change with elevation? Is there a corresponding effect or not? And essentially, one of the primary things is that, yes, there is a reflection of the environment. There was the kind of the general trend that leaf size at lower elevations tend to be much larger. As you go up in elevation, they can become much smaller. That's more of a, you can think of it as a universal observation that many people have had across many different types of plants. So that was noted here. However, one of the things about that also is that the traits do become more similar as you go up in elevation. So that's functional dispersion. So you can think of it as a wedge. You begin tapering as you get higher in elevation. Also, surprisingly, there's an increase in nitrogen with elevation. So I'm unsure with that one, in that whether that has to do with the potting medium and whether there's just simply excess nitrogen available and it was underutilized, or if there may be a different explanation. And then this is what I found to be the interesting part. These are the traits that did not change with elevation. And really, SLA was the one that really stuck out to me. And that really indicates that the stress tolerance strategy was maintained across habitat types, regardless of where you were on elevation gradient, where the plants originated from. So here's a nice plot, no correlations. This is something that actually has also been observed in other studies of rhododendrons along different elevation gradients, also in different parts of the globe. Other traits that were also not significant included things like leaf dry matter content, thickness, toughness, and carbon nitrogen ratio, as well as density. Next, I took a look at the overall trait space. So these are multiple leaf traits all at once, in comparisons of groups based off of growth form or edaphic specialization. Earlier, I mentioned that there was both terrestrial and epiphytic forms. This analysis shows that from at least a leaf trait perspective, there was no difference between the two. When it comes to comparisons based off of edaphic specialization, there also was actually less of a distinction there either. However, on an individual trait basis, nitrogen and SLA values tended to be lower for ultramafic species, despite being grown within again, this kind of more common medium. And lastly, I took a look at how does rhododendron compare to other tropical kind of woody species. And so this is more of a broad meta-analysis. And this actually looks pretty close to my initial predictions, as far as, again, you have this very wide breadth of possible functional trait values at low elevations across species, whereas rhododendron tends to maintain a very narrow band in terms of their trait space across the gradient as a whole. So in essence, rhododendron had less trait variance compared to other taxa. And again, SLA remained constant. Most species, however, SLA goes down with elevation. And again, here you have nitrogen, kind of different responses here. Most species, nitrogen ability goes down. In the instance of rhododendron, it goes up. So, summary of findings. Okay, rhododendron are able to retain a stress-tolerant ecological strategy across habitat types and position along the elevation gradient. And these results really do reinforce this idea of expansion from montane or subalpine habitat types into lower elevation tropical rainforests via a shift from potentially terrestrial to epiphytic growth forms. You can think of this as rhododendrons, they're going to be growing slowly. They're very height limited. How do they get light? Well, they do that by growing on top of other trees. Okay, so one of the other interesting things is that the specialization in the edaphic extremes may also help avoid biotic competition and enable broad tolerance of other stressors. So what I refer to here is, like, for instance, some of the ultramafic species. Those are ones that are able to colonize very different habitat types. For instance, within Borneo, they have some species that are now able to colonize former mining sites, which is a pretty new, very harsh environment type. But it is very exciting that there may be potential bioremediation potential for the genus. So now, lastly, here we are, future directions, where to do next. So ideally through conferences such as this, we can help build international collaborations. One of the things you can think of this as my wish list. Ideally, it'd be nice to be able to compare traits collected in the field with those collected from botanical gardens, get an idea of, are we actually saying the same things? It'd be also useful to examine other plant traits, so more of a whole plant perspective. So not just leaves, but incorporating information about roots, flowers, wood density, and similar metrics. It'd be useful to assess the threat of climate change, getting into more kind of habitat modeling dynamics, as well as incorporating phylogenetic analyses, building off of all the prior research done again on this fabulous genus. And lastly, one of the things that I'm very interested in is expanding this analysis to a much more macro scale. So looking at what are trait trends along latitudinal gradients. So there you go. There's my talk. Hopefully it wasn't too fast. Thank you for your attention.
That was great. It was a great talk. Thank you. I have plenty of questions as usual, so I'm going to start, but go ahead. And Matthias asked a question that was answered during the talk, but we'll just address it in case I think I might have missed it. Did you mentioned that Virias invaded from moderate climate to the tropics in terms of elevation? Did they start first at high altitudes or low altitudes? I think I missed that part.
I think right now the jury's still out on that, but most likely it's at high elevations with expansion down into lower elevation areas.
In my imagination, there was a rhododendron sitting there and the Himalayas lifted up. So it sort of took a ride. That's my imagination though.
Yeah, definitely rhododendron. They have really, really, really small seeds. So they're very similar to orchids as far as these kind of chance events to bring them to different mountain peaks.
That brings up a question that I have is how do the seeds of Virias get into the trees? Are they eaten by birds? How do they get up there?
No, so these are all wind dispersed seeds. Again, they are actually very similar to orchid seeds as far as combination of size, they're dust-like, but also potentially the need for having fungi that they can have symbiotic relationships with as far as a necessary point for germination. In the instances of the epiphytes, there's actually a study that George Argent had done in some of his notes that the ones that are more from epiphytic species tend to have kind of like an additional kind of size surrounding them that help act as a catchment to hold on to potentially tree branches.
Fascinating. Wow. So I have another question, sort of related. So if we compared the microhabitat of these tropical rhodos, so they're growing on a mountaintop in a canopy, is it more similar to a temperate environment than we typically would think of as a tropical environment? Are they sort of in a way escaping the tropics with this lifestyle?
So within the montane cloud forest, those are actually really in a way similar to temperate rainforests as far as you have much cooler temperatures, you have more kind of wet, foggy type of conditions. But the lower elevation is most definitely tropical, much, much hotter, different, more of like a steady rain rather than a mist. And that's where you do have more of the kind of this epiphyte group, is this transition from the cloud forest to the low elevation areas. The temperate comparisons, the really cold temperatures are really going to be much, much, much higher in elevation. One of the interesting things is that some of these locations in Papua New Guinea, for instance, and Malaysia, where you have Mount Kinabalu, also have freezing events. So that's something that for at least tropical plants, that's a really big kind of ecophysiological barrier, are those freezing events. Whereas rhododendron, again, they're coming from a temperate location. They already have many of the adaptations to withstand that type of stress.
That is very cool. So here's a maybe a dumb question. Do Virias have woody tissue?
Yeah. They have very high wood density. And again, I was really intrigued by this group because under most situations within a tropical forest, the race is instead to get light. So generally that's going to favor much taller growing species or vines. And in the instance of rhododendron, they actually have retained their height in a fairly consistent way, regardless of where they are. The difference is they literally became epiphytes and could grow upon other trees to retain their light. In more temperate locations, rhododendrons instead actually tend to be more of an understory, and they tend to be more shade tolerant, whereas Some of these tropical groups, it's more like the light levels, they want to keep the same, so they just kept going up.
Right. You know, a very wise person, Steve Whitman, who's grown a lot of rhodos, once told me all rhododendrons are epiphytes. They just play at being on the ground. So I think it's really interesting to think about this group. We have a question from Ipsberry for leaf traits that did not show significant relationship with elevation. Leaf thickness can be related to dry environments in general. What could be a reason for likely insignificant relation in rhododendron?
So again, I think the way to think of this is more on an ecological strategy basis. Many of the plants retained, again, the stress tolerant type of relationship. So some of these may be that they have the thicker leaves, regardless of location, as a more of an herbivory defense. In some instances, actually, all these areas tended to be fairly wet, whether that is by a rainfall or mist. The one exception to that is actually the highest elevation areas. You're going to have more extremes in water availability because you're literally above the clouds. And in those instances, those leaf size became super itty bitty. They're like, they almost look like pine needles. And so that's, I think, more the approach to adapt.
The axes of variation.
Yeah.
Fascinating talk. Thank you very much. Thank you, Melissa. Great talk. Thank you again for being here in early in the morning for you. It's a huge deal.
Well,
so
thank you for questions and everything.
Absolutely. Yes. Thanks for the great question.